Donald Trump has signed an executive order declaring that his plan to sell TikTok's US operations is legal. Trump says Chinese leader Xi Jinping has agreed to the deal for TikTok's Chinese owner ByteDance to give up control in America. The US Vice President J.D. Vance says the sale would value a new majority American-owned company at $14 billion. That's considerably less than many analysts were expecting. It's great to have Lindsay Gorman with us, Managing Director of the German Marshall Fund's Technology Program. Welcome to you. Now, Trump has signed this executive order outlining the terms of the deal to bring TikTok in the US under US ownership. Do we know how those terms, what they look like?
Well, we're starting to get drips and drabs of information about this deal since the framework deal was announced last week. And what we do know now from the executive order that President Trump just signed is that TikTok's U.S. operations will be owned to the tune of 80% by a group of U.S. investors and shareholders that include Dell, that include Larry Ellison and the Oracle company, and Silver Lake and a couple of others, and that ByteDance will retain about 20% ownership of the company. Now, the devil really is in the details, and here is where there are some, I think, potential sticking points, and that's over who is really owning the algorithm and who is developing the algorithm. Now, the details of the deal that have been reported specify that this new U.S. predominantly owned entity will control the algorithm, and key in the executive order and also in the vice president's remarks were this idea that it will be the U.S. company that's making content moderation decisions, that is, deciding which content gets shown and promoted on the platform. But I think this is a bit of a sticky issue because the algorithm itself, we believe, will be licensed from ByteDance. So who's actually writing that algorithm, and how do we know who's controlling what content gets shown?
Interesting. I sort of want to ask you a bit more about that. Does that mean that the app is going to be, I guess, retrained using US data?
Well, I think these are really the key questions that the deal, as reported, leaves open. Right now, it seems like the algorithm is going to be licensed, which could mean that ByteDance develops the algorithm, it trains it on the data across the platform, and it continues to modify it. And this U.S. investor group just licensed that algorithm from the ByteDance company and the engineers that are developing it. Now, the deal also says that Oracle will oversee this, and that the data of American users, which TikTok has always said has been stored on American soil, won't be in the hands of the Chinese entities, and that Oracle will oversee this. So in theory, that's the way it would, I think, be supposed to work. But we've had many cases in the past where TikTok had said that none of this data was going back to China, and then it was later revealed that some TikTok employees in China were accessing information on American journalists and users. So this is the question and the problem with having to do this scrupulous oversight.
Yeah.
And the executive order contemplates that Oracle, and that it will be very, very well managed and scrupulously overseen. But then again, if that's needed, then who is actually owning the algorithm and the data itself?
Yeah, lots of interesting questions that this brings up. Thanks so much for that, Lindsay. That's Lindsay Gorman, Managing Director of the German Marshall Fund's Technology Program. I'm joined now by Aynne Kokas. She's a professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. She's the author of the book Trafficking Data: How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty. Thank you so much for your time. In your book, you argue that Chinese firms exploit weak US data governance. In your opinion, does this deal meaningfully address these types of vulnerabilities?
Well, so one thing that I think is really important for us to realize is that while there was an executive order, we still have 120 days to actually negotiate the details of the deal. And so this is, I think, a really important nuance for us to look at. Also, there will be oversight from the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to assess the relative compliance of the deal to the congressional legislation. At that point, we also have the opportunity for congressional oversight. So one thing that I think is important to note is while this executive order is a big step forward with respect to keeping TikTok operating, there are still a lot of steps that have a lot of different players engaged that we still need to see come to fruition.
You've just outlined some of the checks and balances that has to happen in the next 120 days or so. Is there a risk, though, that even with US ownership, TikTok could still be used for influence operations or data collection aligned with Chinese interests?
So one thing that I think is really important to understand about the US landscape is that we have a data broker industry that actually allows user data to be purchased and sold by social media companies. And so as a result, when we're seeing this TikTok deal, what essentially will happen is the data of users will be then subject to very similar guidance as we see for apps like Facebook or Instagram, which can also sell their data to the highest bidder. And so we'll still see this highly fluid data ecosystem that continues to operate in the US because unlike in the European Union, we don't see the same types of national data governance that protects user data.
OK. Donald Trump says Xi Jinping has agreed to the deal. Why would China be motivated to make a deal on the app?
Well, one thing that I think is important to note is, once again, we still have a lot of steps for this deal to actually come to fruition. So there have to be financial deals made between companies that have interests that are cross purposes. Also, a lot of these companies have investments in China. So one firm that has been discussed is Oracle. Oracle also has very strong Chinese investments. So when we're thinking about Xi's agreement in this case, we're thinking about it at this very moment in time. But I'll be interested to see over the coming months how this all plays out. Also, of course, Xi has a big incentive to agree because we're engaged in these tariff negotiations. So there is a lot of pressure there. The other question that will be also really interesting to understand is who owns the TikTok algorithm and how that ownership and data sharing actually plays out in the final deal. So we're seeing right now an executive order, but we're not actually seeing the relationships between these companies and how they're data sharing in the development of the algorithm.
Yeah, there's some really interesting points you've made there, particularly about the algorithm. Thanks so much, Anne. That's Aynne Kokas, Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia.